G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Book of Daniel. This is a study that has been prepared by Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum of RL Ministries worldwide. Thank you for coming along. So good morning all, this is session 9. We're going to cover chapter 5 verse 22 down to chapter 6 verse 9 today. Last session, Belshazzar was having a bit of a party with all of his cronies, and he was using the Jewish temple objects as part of their worship of their pagan gods, and a hand came out from the wall and started writing in the wall. His wife, obviously he was petrified. His wise men could not or wouldn't interpret it for him, so the king was very troubled about that. And then the Queen Mother came in and she said, listen, you need to fetch this guy from your grandfather's day, a man called Daniel. He says, fetch him, he'll tell you what it is. So Daniel comes in, and Daniel, straight up, he gives them a bit of a history lesson about his grandfather. And we're going to pick up now where Daniel is with him. And we're going to see the sin of Belshazzar here in verse 22 to 24. And this is Daniel berating, as it were, Belshazzar. And you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. This was the history that Daniel has told him about his grandfather. But have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. You have praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know. And the God in whose hand your breath is, and whose are all your ways, have you not glorified. And was a part of the hand sent from before him, and this writing was inscribed. So in the case of Belshazzar, he was not in ignorance. Daniel says, you knew all this. Belshazzar knew everything that had happened to his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar. And also, he knew the reason for it. And while Nebuchadnezzar's sin came out of ignorance, Belshazzar's sin was willful. Yeah, and this was taking the utensils from the Jewish temple and using them to worship his pagan gods. Now, Daniel says he had failed to humble himself. His pride and defiance was directed against the Lord of heaven in verse 23. And this can be seen in the way he ordered the vessels of the Jewish temple to be brought in, and wine was drunk from them for the purpose of worshipping the gods of silver, gold, brass, iron, wood, and stone. So he and his lords, his wives, and his concubines had all drunk from these vessels. And the emphasis in verse 23 is that it was because of what he knew that he deliberately and purposefully desecrated these vessels. And what was that for? It was to show that he was not intimidated by this God of Israel, any more than he was intimidated by the Medes and the Persians just outside his walls. He didn't just do it upon a whim. He knew exactly what had happened to his grandfather and why it had happened. And it is because of what he knew that he purposely ordered the vessels belonging to the holy God of Israel brought into his banquet to show these 1,000 lords of his that he was not going to be intimidated. So rather than praising the God of Israel, he chose to worship the gods of gold, silver, brass, iron, wood, and stone. And all these gods have 3 areas of inability. They cannot see, they cannot hear, and they cannot know. And he failed to glorify the God of Israel, who controlled his very breath, in whose hand was his very life. Now, as Belshazzar would find out that same night, he's the God who controlled all his ways, which means his destiny. Now, this same God who has this kind of control over him has now acted in judgment in verse 24. The one who controls Belshazzar's destiny is about to bring his life to an end. And Daniel says that it was at that point the part of the hand was sent from before him, and this writing was now inscribed. The decree of judgment had been sent from heaven. Now, having condemned Belshazzar in his tactful way, Daniel now comes to the interpretation of the writing. And this is the verse 25 to 28. And this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, tekel, upharsin. So this is the interpretation of the things. Mene, God hath numbered your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you are weighed in the balances and are found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Now these 3 words, Mene, tekel, and upharsin, are all common measures of weight. The first Aramaic word menai is the same as the Hebrew word manai, which is found in passages like 1 Kings 10:17 and Ezra 2:69 and Nehemiah 7:71 to 72. Now that word is doubled at the beginning. Now, according to Ezekiel 45:12, 60 shekels made one of these minas, this is the word menai or manai. Second word, tekel, is Aramaic for the Hebrew shekel, and this equivalent is found in Ezekiel 45, verse 12. Third word, as it appears on the wall, is upharsin, which is really three parts of a word. First of the U is just simply and, it's a conjunction. And then the second part, far, was half a main, like half a shekel. Shekel is a weight, and this is half a main. And the third, manai, the third part, sin, is simply the plural form. So if you put these two together, the singular form is Perez, as it appears in verse 28. Thus, Perez is the singular, farsin is the plural, and upharsin just means and plus the plural form. Okay. What's it all mean then? All three words, menai, tekel, and Perez, written on the wall, refer to standards, measures of weight. And the emphasis now is that God has a standard, and Belshazzar has dismally failed to measure up to that standard. And Daniel now gets specific. So that was the writing in verse 25, but the interpretation we see in verses 26 to 28. In verse 26, first of all, we have the menai. Now, this Aramaic word has two basic meanings. That's why it's mentioned twice, because both meanings will come out. One meaning is to number or to count or to fix the limit. Second meaning is to appoint or appointed. So, in fact, this very word is translated with this meaning in Daniel 2, verse 49 and Daniel 3, verse 12. Now, on the plaster of the wall, this word was written not just once, but twice. Menai, menai, because both meanings are going to be relevant. The first menai has to do with being numbered. God has numbered thy kingdom. This means that God had counted the number of days and years allotted to the kingdom of Babylon and to the rule of Belshazzar. He had fixed a limit as to how long the kingdom would last and how far Belshazzar will be allowed to go. And that limit had now been reached. The second meaning, appointed, has to do with the last phrase of verse 26. His kingdom has been brought to an end. This means the end of his kingdom had been appointed in accordance with the second menai, and God had numbered the days of his life and appointed the day in which it will end, and that end has now come. Not only has the end of his personal life been appointed, but those who are to bring the empire to an end have also been appointed, and these are the Medes and the Persians. In fact, a specific king, Cyrus, has been appointed to bring this kingdom to an end, and he was already prophesied and named twice, more than 150 years earlier, by the prophet Isaiah. Cyrus was prophesied by name in Isaiah 44, verse 28, and Isaiah 45, verse 1, long before he ever appeared on the scene. Verse 27 now deals with the meaning of tekel. This was used as an absolute standard of weight. We see it in passages such as 1 Samuel 2:3, Job 31:6, Psalm 62:9, and Proverbs 16:2. This word was used in these passages to show that it kept the measure of an absolute standard. And the application to Belshazzar in verse 27 is this: you have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. In other words, you have failed to conform to a standard. The tekel actually explains the reason for the menai. The menai means that his days had been numbered and had come to an appointed end. And the reason they had come to an appointed end is because he had been placed in the balance and weighed against the true standard, and he had fallen short. He was not heavy enough. So Belshazzar had failed to conform to God's standard. In verse 28, we come to the Perez. The word Perez is singular, while upharsin is plural. So again, it refers to the same thing as already been explained. The plural form Pharsin simply refers to more than one Perez. Perez also has a double meaning, which is why the plural is being used here. Root of the word means to divide, but it also means Persia or Persians. So both these meanings are now brought out in verse 28. In light of the fact that Belshazzar has not reached the standard which God required and that he has failed to conform to a standard, and in light of the fact that his days have now been numbered and his end appointed, that means his kingdom is divided, which is the first meaning of Perez. Second meaning of Perez is also brought out because his kingdom was divided between the Medes and the Persians. And the fact it was given to both peoples was also prophesied by Isaiah in Isaiah 21 verses 1 to 10. The truth is that the wise men were able to read the words Mene, Tekel, and Pharsin because these were regular Aramaic words and they were just terms referring to simple measures of weight. So the fact that the wise men could not read the writing does not mean that they could not make out the letters. It means that they could not read the words in the sense of giving them any meaning. Therefore, they could not interpret what was written. So this is not good news for Belshazzar. And in verses 25 to 28, the judgment has now been revealed. Now we see the reward for Daniel in verse 29. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold about his neck and made proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. So the promise Belshazzar made earlier in this chapter he now keeps. He will fulfill his promise, although in verse 17 Daniel had earlier repudiated any desire for these gifts. So Daniel was clothed in purple, he had a big gold chain around his neck, and he was appointed to the third top position in the Babylonian Empire. However, what good was all of this? The kingdom was coming to an end. What good was it? Well, these rewards were completely irrelevant now, because on this very night of feasting, the Babylonian Empire was coming to an end. So Daniel gets to be the third man in the kingdom for just a few hours. However, being appointed in this high position by Belshazzar in the last hours of the Babylonian Empire does set the stage for his high position under the Persians in the very next chapter. Because in chapter 6, we see that the Persians took the city intact, and the people who were already in leadership positions were given positions of authority to rule under the Medes and the Persians. So what is happening here is that God, in his complete control of events, is preparing the stage for Daniel. Because when the Persians take over in chapter 6, Daniel is given a top position in the Persian administration, which is set up to rule the city of Babylon. So it did help. Also at this point, Daniel was over 80 years old. So how would these Persian strangers now know how to pick Daniel for this post in order to ensure a continuity of the bureaucracy necessary to administrate the affairs of Babylon? Of course, they did not know. And so after they'd got rid of the key people like Belshazzar and Nabonidus, they would pick those who had already been in the Babylonian government and set them in positions of authority in order to create a smooth transition in the change of empire. So little does Belshazzar realize that what he's doing for Daniel in verse 29 is going to set the stage for him to be placed in a high position of authority in the new Persian administration in chapter 6. It is because of Daniel's high position vis-a-vis Persia, which originates here under Belshazzar in Babylon, that he probably used his high office to influence Cyrus, the Persian monarch, to issue his decree to allow the Jews to go back to Jerusalem, rebuild the city and the temple. Now, Cyrus's decree is found in 2 Chronicles 36, 22 to 23, and again, we see it in Ezra 1, verses 1 to 4, and Ezra 6, verses 3 to 5. We're pretty sure that Cyrus is influenced to do what he did by the work of Daniel. we're gonna look more about the decree when we get to Daniel 9. In it, the temple was to be rebuilt, and the cost was to be defrayed by the Persian government. They were going to pay for it. Cyrus even left some specifications for the building, and he permitted all the Jews who wished to return to go back to Israel, and they would actually be given financial help to do so. So then these very vessels which had been brought by Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon in chapter 1 and desecrated by Belshazzar in chapter 5 will be permitted by Cyrus in chapter 9 to be taken back to the city of Jerusalem and the temple. So things do not change. Today, if you want to go back to Israel, that's fine, but if not, send money. That's Arnold. Now, in chapter 5, verse 30 to 31, we see the fulfillment. In that night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So two things are noted as a result. First of all, the fall of Babylon in verse 30. In that very same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. He was just about the only casualty when Babylon was taken. Remember, he was not watching anymore. He was giving a party, and there were no watchmen on the wall when the final attack came. Therefore, when the attack came, no one was there to defend Babylon. Because the Euphrates River encircled the city, the majority of residents thought the walls were impenetrable. On the same night as its fall was predicted, he also died. The Medes and the Persians, who had been besieging the city while the Babylonians were feasting in the palace, had been occupied in trying to breach the city wall. It was impossible. But they found that they had another option, which was to utilize the fact that the Euphrates River flowed through the center of the city. And they tried to get underneath the gates, which were situated over the water of the river. But the water level was too high to do this. So what do? They moved back out of the city, and they dug a canal to divert the water of the Euphrates and lower the water level in that section of it which flowed through the city. And when the level had dropped sufficiently for the Persian soldiers to ford the river, they crossed over into Babylon and took it peacefully. In fact, almost the only casualty happened to be Belshazzar the king. Now, bit of chronology of how it happened in keeping with Daniel's prophecies. On April 7th, 539 BC, which was the 4th of Nisan, Nisan is a Jewish month, it was a New Year festival observed by the Babylonians, and that was to be their last. In the months of September and October 539, which is the month of Tishri, the city of Opis, which was a major city before Babylon was attacked and taken. October the 12th, 539 BC, and the 14th of Tishri, the next major city, Sippar, was taken. On October 14th, 539 BC, which was the 16th of Tishri, the city of Babylon was taken. Now, it was not taken directly by Cyrus, but by his commander-in-chief, a man called Ugbaru. Between the months of September and October that same year, we have the first cuneiform tablet actually calling Cyrus the king of Babylon. On October 29th, 539 BC, which was a third of Cheshvan, that's the way the Jewish months were known then, Cyrus finally entered the city of Babylon, and he appointed Ugbaru to be the governor or the king of the province of Babylon. Ugbaru was called king, but he was a sub-king under Cyrus. Now we know from all the various ancient accounts of the fall of Babylon that Cyrus himself was not the leader of the attacking force. He was away elsewhere. He was helping to divert the river. Rather, his army general who took the city was a man named Ugbaru, and he was the commander-in-chief leading Cyrus's forces who entered the city and killed Belshazzar. Now, we also know from ancient records that when Cyrus did finally arrive in Babylon a few days after it had fallen, he appointed a governor over Babylon whose name was Ugbaru. Now, Ugbaru and another one called Gubaru sound very much alike. And for that reason, in the Greek account, both names were spelled the same way as Gabrias. I think that's on the next slide, actually. Let me just have a quick squeeze. No, okay. Now, now. Now, we also know now that this Ugbaru and Gubaru, their names were in the Greek Gabrias, and for years all the biblical scholars felt that Gubaru the general, or Ugbaru the general, and Gubaru the governor were one and the same person called Gabrias. But other documents have now showed that Ugbaru and Gubaru, although they sound similar, were nevertheless two different people. The general was Ugbaru, who took the city, and he died about 8 days later, falling to a fatal illness. And it was after his death that Ugbaru was appointed governor by Cyrus. Well, I'm going to tell you why I'm telling you this. Now, earlier in history, because these two men were somewhat confused with each other, people made fun of Daniel at this point. They said that Daniel made a mistake by making the person Gubaru king of Babylon because he had died. But as it turned out, there were two different people. On November 5th, 539, which is the 10th of Shavan, the next to the last Nabonidus tablet records what Ugbaru was doing. He was going out to attack someone to try to do something, but he did not do much. And then we see November 6th, 539 BC, the 11th of Cheshvan, which is the Jewish month. That's when Ugbaru, the commander-in-chief, suddenly dies. November 19th, 539 BC, which was the 24th of Cheshvan, the second tablet by Cyrus is written. Again, he's referring to himself as the king of Babylon. It'll be made clear very shortly. We're getting there. November and December of that same year, which was the Jewish month of Kislev, the last of the Nabonidus tablets was written as far as we have records of it. On March 21st, 538 BC, which was the month of Adar, began a period of mourning for a prominent person, and it is believed by historians that Belshazzar's mother, Nitocris, the woman who plays a role in chapter 5, dies. The mourning ended on March the 26th, 538 BC, or the 3rd of Nisan. On March 27, 538 BC, the 4th of Nisan, Cambyses, the son of Cyrus, enters the Babylonian temple for a ceremony. At that moment, the Persians owned the city in totality. A couple of accounts of the fall of Babylon by some ancient historians, one by a Greek, one by Cyrus himself. The account is by the Greek historian Herodotus, was written some 200 years before Christ. That was in that intertestamental period. Just listen how closely he follows some of the things that Daniel says. Here's a quotation from what he wrote. This was Herodotus. Cyrus advanced against Babylon, but the Babylonians, having taken the field, awaited his coming. When he advanced near to the city, the Babylonians gave battle, and being defeated, were shut up in the city. Thus they had been long aware of the restless spirit of Cyrus, and saw that he attacked all nations alike. They had laid up provisions for many years, and therefore were under no apprehensions about a siege. On the other hand, Cyrus found himself in a difficulty, since much time had elapsed and his affairs for Babylon were not advanced. Whether therefore someone else made a suggestion in his perplexity, or whether he himself devised a plan, he had recourse to the following strategy. Having stationed the bulk of his army near the passage of the river where it enters Babylon, and again having stationed another division beyond the city where the river makes its exit, he gave order to his forces to enter the city as soon as they should see the river was fordable, means you could walk over it. Having stationed these forces and given them these directions, he himself marched away with the ineffective part of his army. Having come to the lake, Cyrus did the same with respect to the river and the lake, as the cream of the Babylonians once had done, having diverted the river by means of a canal into the lake, which was before a swamp. He made the ancient channel fordable by the sinking of the river. And when this took place, the Persians who were appointed to that purpose, close to the streams of the river, which now subsided to about the middle of a man's thigh, entered Babylon by this passage. If, however, the Babylonians had been aware of it beforehand and had known what Cyrus was doing, they would not have suffered the Persians to enter their city, but would have utterly destroyed them for having shut all the little gates that led to the river. And having mounted the walls, they would have been able to extend the banks of the river, and would have caught the Persians in a net. Whereas the Persians came upon them by surprise, it is related by the people who inhabited the city that by reason of its great extent, when they who were at the extremities were taken, those of the Babylonians who lived in the center of the city knew nothing of their capture. For it happened to be a festival. They were dancing at the time and enjoying themselves till they received certain information of the truth, and thus Babylon was taken for the first time. Now, this account written by a Greek historian 200 years before Christ agrees with Daniel in one important respect. That is, the Babylonians were having a festival. They were feasting at the time the Persians entered the city, and they were not aware that the Persians had actually gained control until it was too late. Even more important than this account by Herodotus is an account written by Cyrus himself, and he gives the credit for his capture of Babylon to the Babylonian god Marduk. Marduk, this is Cyrus's writing. Marduk, the great god and protector of his people, and the worshippers beheld with pleasure Cyrus's good deeds and upright heart, and therefore ordered him to march against his city Babylon. He made him set out on the road to Babylon, going at his side like a real friend. His widespread troops, their number like that of the water of a river, could not be established, stroll along, their weapons packed away. Without any battle, he made him enter his town of Babylon, sparing Babylon any calamity, and he delivered into Cyrus's hands Nabonidus the king, who did not worship Marduk. That's as far as the account of Cyrus goes. The important thing to note here is that the Cyrus account also agrees that Babylon was taken intact with virtually no fighting whatsoever. And according to the Bible, only one man lost his life, and that was King King Belshazzar, wrong king. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, verse 31, being about 62 years old. Now, second result we see here in verse 31 concerning Darius the Mede. The verb which says receive the kingdom, received implies that a higher authority than Darius gave him the kingdom. So this higher authority was Cyrus the Great. At the time of this gift, Darius was about 62 years old. Here again, critics have been picking on Daniel because in the records of the conquest of Babylon, there is no mention of Darius the Mede per se, because we have no other record of this man existing as ruler over the city of Babylon. So the critics have now tried to make mincemeat of Daniel chapter 5, verse 31. But what they used to do with Belshazzar until documents were discovered, so with Darius the Mede. It does not mean that he did not exist. And based upon our present historical records, we can fairly well pinpoint who was this Darius the Mede of verse 31. Two basic options. Again, Babylon was conquered not by Cyrus the Great directly, but by his commander-in-chief, Ugbaru. He is the one who actually led the army of Cyrus into Babylon on the night of the feast of chapter 5. Nabonidus, the real king, had actually fled Babylon on the night before, or was captured and died in exile. Babylon itself fell on October 14th, 539 BC. Earlier, we learned that before Babylon fell, Cyrus captured two other key Babylonian cities, one of which was Opis. So Cyrus and his own troops remained in Opis, and they only arrived in Babylon after it was taken in October 29, 539 BC. Now, 8 days later, his commander-in-chief, Ugbaru, died. So Cyrus took Gubaru, the next person down, and made him the governor of the province of Babylon. And he served in this position from 539 until 525 BC. Now, actually, Ugbaru and Gubaru, you can see why they sounded very similar, get confused. Ugbaru, the general, dies 8 days after Cyrus arrives in Babylon. So there's an overlap in the city between Ugbaru and Gubaru only by 8 days. Again, in the Greek writings, the two Persian names are spelled as Gabrias, and that is where the confusion lies. Now, some feel that Darius the Mede is the same as Cyrus the Persian. And in chapter 6, verse 28, we notice here that it reads, so this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So some people say that the word and should really be translated by the word even. Then they would read verse 28 as, well, so Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius, even in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And that is actually a valid translation for the Aramaic word here that means and, primarily, and even secondarily. But there's a basic rule of interpretation which states that we should always take the primary meaning unless it is impossible. So that being so, there's no need to resort to the secondary meaning here. So it is better here to make it, when we get to chapter 6 and verse 28, it is better to make Darius the Mede and Cyrus the Persian two different men. Darius the Mede of chapter 531 would then be the same as Gubaru of the historical records. He was born in the year 601 BC to Ahasuerus, who was a Mede. Therefore, he's called the Mede, Darius the Mede. He became governor of Babylon according to this passage here and later in Daniel chapter 9 verse 1. Now according to verse 31 it says that Darius the Mede received the kingdom. What does it mean to receive a kingdom? It means to be given the kingdom from a higher authority. And in this case the higher authority was Cyrus the Great. And since he was the highest authority, then Darius the Mede must be of lesser authority. Therefore Darius the Mede was the same as the Gubaru, the governor of Babylon, of all these ancient records. He is the one who received the kingdom from Cyrus, who was the reigning monarch, making Darius the Mede the de facto king, while Cyrus withdrew from Babylon the same year. So he, Darius, had the kingly authority over this province, but again, he would be viewed as a petty king, as a little king under the great king Cyrus. One last thing about chapter 5 is the lesson to be learned. Sooner or later, the Gentile empires will come to an end. Daniel had already predicted the rise of 4 Gentile empires in chapter 2, and we're going to see later again in chapter 7, with each succeeding the previous one in turn. He had predicted the fall of Babylon in favor of a second Gentile empire, and now it has happened. What happened to Babylon will happen to all of them. They're all destined to fall, but what happened to Babylon is also predictive of what will happen to another Babylon in the future. The city of Babylon will be rebuilt, and it's going to become the world capital under the authority of the Antichrist, but only to fall again in Revelation chapter 18. Now, Daniel in the lion's den. This goes from chapter 6, verse 1 to verse 28. We're going to look at the position of Daniel in the first 3 verses here. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, who should be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might give account unto them, and that the king should have no damage. Then this Daniel was distinguished above the presidents and the satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. So in verses 1 and 2, we're told about the reorganization of the new kingdom, because Babylon is now no longer the capital of an empire, but rather one province within the larger Medo-Persian Empire. Darius, of course, was not appointed king over the entire Persian Empire, but rather over the province of Babylon. So his top position was limited to the province of Babylon, where he set up his own bureaucracy, which comprised, on the bottom level, 120 satraps. He then subdivided the whole province of Babylon so that it required 120 of these satraps to act as overseers. Now, in addition to these men, he appointed 3 others over them, whom he called presidents, and they were co-equal. And one of these 3 presidents was Daniel himself. Now, why appoint Daniel to such a high position? Because remember, Daniel already had the 3rd highest position in Babylon, having been appointed to that office during the last day in the life of Belshazzar and the Babylonian Empire. So his position of authority is effectively carried over into chapter 6 as well. So Darius the Mede was over the 3 presidents, and above Darius the Mede is Cyrus the Great, or Cyrus the Persian. Daniel was co-equal with the other 2 presidents, and these satraps had to answer to them while the presidents answered to Darius. The purpose of the reorganization was that the king should have no damage. In other words, this type of government was supposed to prevent any problems for Darius, and it would guarantee his financial interests. In verse 3, during the course of time, we see that Darius noted that because Daniel had an excellent spirit, he was superior to the other two presidents. So he had in mind to promote him even further and to set him over the whole realm. He probably mentioned this to the other two presidents at some stage, so that if Daniel were elevated to this higher position, the other two would be placed under Daniel's authority. Now, with this new system, you would have the 120 satraps, over them the two presidents, and over the two presidents, Daniel. Then Daniel alone would be answerable to Darius the Mede. The king's plan certainly brought great honor to Daniel, but as we're going to see, it also brought him great danger. For Daniel is the only Jew among the entire crowd, and that fact will bring up the problem of anti-Semitism again, as it did back in chapter 3. So Darius's plan now leads to conspiracy. We see this in verses 4 to 9. Then the presidents and the satraps sought to find occasion against Daniel as touching the kingdom, but they could find no occasion nor fault, for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. Then said these men, We shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Then these presidents and satraps assembled together to the king, and said thus unto the king, King Darius, live forever. Verse 7. All the presidents of the kingdom, the deputies and the satraps, the councillors and the governors have consulted together to establish a royal statute. And there's a mucked up the typing here. Verse 8. Now, O king, establish the interdict and sign the writing, that it be not changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the interdict. Sorry there, I've mucked up some words there. I can't decipher what it's supposed to mean. So what we see here is that the conspiracy against Daniel developed in two stages. The first conspiracy we see in verse 4, where they tried to find a fault in him. They tried to pick on some area where he was misusing his authority and high position. And this is a question of the moral ethics of his position. They tried to find occasion against Daniel, some degree of irregularity in his administration. But they couldn't put a finger on anything, because in verse 4 we're told he was absolutely faithful to his responsible position. He had not used it for personal advantage and advancement. He only rightly used his position to carry out the affairs of the king. So this first attempt to find a basis for accusation against him and to have him removed from office failed. And in verses 5 to 8, this leads to a second conspiracy. In verse 5, they conclude that the only area where they might possibly accuse Daniel is not in the realm of his position, because he's too faithful and too ethical, but it is in the law of his God, which was Daniel's worship of the one true God had now been observed for a very long time, beginning in the days of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 1. Now more than 70 years have passed, and Daniel is still faithful to his God. So they conspire to set up an occasion or a situation or an environment where his loyalty to God will bring him into conflict with his loyalty to Darius the Mede. And then they think they'll have solid grounds for an accusation. So their plan is now brought out in verses 6 to 7. The conspirators assembled themselves together. It included here both the other two presidents and an unspecified number of satraps. And now it is highly unlikely that the entire 120 satraps were involved, but only those within the province of the city of Babylon itself. They assembled together, and this verb in Aramaic emphasizes the eagerness with which they did it. The Aramaic term for assembled, hagishu, means being in tumult. It emphasizes a real eagerness. The group came thronging, and they worked in unison. They came and eagerly presented their plan to Darius and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. Now, in the course of this conspiracy in verse 7, their suggestion involves a lie, because they tell Darius that all the bureaucracy of the Persian Empire made a decision, and they claim that all the presidents of the kingdom, the deputies, the satraps, the councillors, and the governors, had been consulting, and they had all agreed to this idea they were putting forward. Of course, this is a lie, because we know that Daniel, at least, had not been consulted. And who knows who else might have been excluded from the plot. So they lie to the king, telling him that every one of his administrators had agreed to this proposal. And at this point, Darius obviously assumes that Daniel agrees with this. But they set the case up in such a way as to deceive, and they lie to the king, saying that this was a unanimous decision, which was not true. They were suggesting that Darius establish a royal statute and make a strong interdict or a decree. Now, the content of this new law should be that anyone who made any petition of any god or man, that is a priest, except of Darius, for a period of 30 days, he is to suffer the death penalty. So, no one can ask a petition of any god or any man, such as a priest, for a period of 30 days. This meant that if anyone was going to pray to his god, his request could only be offered through the mediation of Darius the Mede. And they put a time limit on it of 30 days. And anyone who disobeys this law, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, historical sources confirm that the Babylonians employed fire as a method of execution. And there's actually no proof of this form of capital punishment in Persian records so far. However, it is known that lions were caught in pits and at times kept in cages or zoological gardens. So the Persians could have used a different mode of execution at this time, such as the lion's den. And then in verse 8, we see a decision is now reached. Now, O king, establish the interdict and sign the writing. So Darius signed the writing and he established the interdict according to the law of the Medes and Persians. That way, it would become an immutable Medo-Persian law that could not be abrogated. Now, under Persian law, any command or decree signed and sealed by the king was unalterable. Couldn't change it. Even the emperor lacked the authority to repeal it. So Daniel would be subject to the same rule. So once Darius had signed and sealed the conspirators' decree, it could not be revoked. And verse 9 indicates the king signed the decree. Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the interdict. Now, one reason perhaps why he signed this why Darius signed this was his own sense of vanity. After all, this would feed his own egotism, for everyone to recognize that for 30 days he would be treated as a god. Everyone would have to go to him and ask him to grant their petitions. There's also a second possible reason here. Under Persian law, the ruler was always considered to be the son and the representative and the manifestation of the people's God. An earlier quotation from Cyrus, when he explained how he conquered Babylon, he said that he had been sent to do it by Marduk. Now, Marduk happened to be the chief god of Babylon, but Cyrus was not a Babylonian, he was a Persian. However, since he had conquered Babylon, according to the Persian system of theology, he was now the son, the representative and manifestation of the Babylonian god Marduk. So as a result of this theology, these world rulers would demand the subjected nations to do religious homage to the king as recognition that he is a son of their God. Now, a person was not required to abandon his religion or repudiate his own gods. So this action would not bother anyone who was a polytheist anyway. All that was required in this instance was that Darius the Mede be recognized as a son of the representative god Marduk for a period of just 30 days. That's all. So for 30 days, everyone must present his petitions to their national gods like Marduk or Bel only through Darius, who was now considered to be the son of these national gods of Babylon. This is really a matter of pure politics here. It was a way of testing the loyalty of the subjugated people. A pagan could do this without violating his conscience because to him it was merely a political issue. However, for a Jew, it was not a political issue, but a religious issue. No Jew could accept Darius as a manifestation of their God Jehovah. So for them, it was not just a question of showing loyalty to the new government, which they could easily subscribe to, but it was a fundamentally religious issue, and so they could not do it. Of course, this was something that Daniel would not do. What these men had proposed could not be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not, or which passes not away. Under Persian law, any decree that was signed by the king and sealed with the king's ring could never be replaced. Not even the emperor of Persia had the power or the authority to repeal a decree he had signed and sealed. And that's why the Medo-Persian Empire, according to the Daniel 2 account, was inferior to the Babylonians because the Babylonian king was an absolute monarch. But the Medo-Persian sovereign was not above the mistakes of his law. Same problem we see in the book of Esther when Haman, using the king's ring, sealed a decree sentencing every Jew in the Persian Empire to death, which meant all of the Jews of the world at that point. And that decree could not be repealed, even though Haman, the author of this decree, was later hung. The decree still stood. The only way to get it around it was to issue a second decree in Esther 8 that said upon the same day when Jews became fair game to be killed, they were free to take up weapons to defend themselves. Okay, that is our lot for this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.